Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to get on the line and get in through the waiting room. But we're going to get started around 202 or 203 if you're in Eastern time. So thanks for holding on, and feel free to go explore the map tool that Ann DePetta would have sent to you via email earlier today. Great. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today on today's Middle Neighborhoods webinar, Mapping Middle Neighborhoods, a national tool and local perspectives. My name is David Sanchez. I'm going to be the moderator today. I work at the National Community Stabilization Trust, where I'm the director of research, and I coordinate our involvement in the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative and our work coordinating the National Steering Committee. Today's webinar is also presented by the Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice, which includes many of you out there across the country. It's about 350 practitioners and those interested in middle neighborhood efforts. Today I am delighted to be joined by two presenters. First, I'll introduce my colleague and friend, Jason Powers. Jason Powers is the project director for the Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, where he's served since April 2019. His position with the city government is sponsored by the Cleveland Foundation as part of a city-led partnership to provide longer-term strategic support within municipal government. Prior to his work with the city of Cleveland, Jason was the director of marketing and development at the Old Brooklyn Community Development Corporation. Before returning to Cleveland, he worked at NeighborWorks America in Washington, D.C. as the National Public Affairs and Communications Manager, supporting a network of over 250 community development nonprofits. Early in his career, Jason served for 5 years as legislative advisor to Congressman John W. Oliver, who's the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee for the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Transit. Jason holds degrees from Indiana University and City University of London. I'm also delighted to be joined today by Amber Lynch, who is the executive director of Invest DSM. Invest DSM is a unique collaboration between the city of Des Moines and Polk County, which brings a renewed commitment to neighborhood revitalization in the city. Invest DSM is actually began and chartered to carry out Des Moines' middle neighborhood strategy in 4 special improvement districts. And before becoming the executive director of Invest DSM, Amber was the senior city planner for Des Moines, Iowa, working in the city's neighborhood development division since 2008. And in her time with the city, she oversaw the reimagining of Des Moines' longstanding neighborhood revitalization programs. I'm going to speak first about, just to give an overview of NCSC's involvement in the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative and to introduce the national tool that we are releasing today, which should be in all of your emails, and we'll put it in the chat as well for you guys to access it. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about the work that he's doing in Cleveland, and then over to Amber to talk about her work in Des Moines. So just some background on the Middle Neighborhood Initiative. The Middle Neighborhood Initiative today encompasses 2 parts. The first is a national initiative, which is spearheaded by NCST and advised by a steering committee of 20 researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And the national initiative is really focused on mobilizing attention to middle neighborhoods and reversing the trend of their disappearance. So we do that through research, we do that through policy development, and we do that by focusing on research and communications that calls attention to the value of middle neighborhoods and the challenges that are facing them. The second piece of the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is the Community of Practice, which is the entity bringing us today's webinar, and that is supported by NeighborWorks America and staffed by a small team of organizers. So the whole idea of creating a middle neighborhoods mapping tool was, I mean, it comes back to a pretty foundational question. You know, I think many of us on this call, the idea of a middle neighborhood makes intuitive sense, and I think many of us, you know, looking out at the regions that we live in, can probably identify a few examples of what we think of as a middle neighborhood, and we probably have some idea about the challenges facing them. But the real rub comes when trying to create a precise of a middle neighborhood. We often like to say that you know, it's useful to think of the middle neighborhood or the regions in your neighborhood along a spectrum from healthy and thriving to overtly distressed. And middle neighborhoods are those that fall into the middle of those. They're long-standing, stable communities for middle and working class families. But as a result of a number of trends we're seeing, like increased income inequality and wealth inequality, today many middle neighborhoods are on the edge of either growth or decline. In many regions, what we see is middle neighborhoods are faltering in their sustainability. So their housing market is not reliably attracting replacement owner occupants. It's not reliably generating home values that support quality maintenance or wealth building for tenants. And oftentimes they're not able, they're faltering in their ability to attract responsible and engaged investors and landlords. In a number of regions, though, the problems facing middle neighborhoods are different, and especially in regions with strong employment growth or with constrained regional housing supplies, middle neighborhoods are facing gentrification and displacement. So we think that in these situations, that there's a critical opportunity to ensure that existing residents share in the community's growing prosperity and to preserve affordable housing before it is lost. So, you know, going back to the question of what is a middle neighborhood, there are a couple different approaches that one could take. And the first one that I'll mention here is the one that NCST has actually adopted in its nationwide map, which is defining middle neighborhoods based on the incomes of those who live there. So put simply, middle neighborhoods are places where middle income households live. There are a couple of, you know, when you get into the data and you really start trying to apply that definition, you quickly have to face questions about, you know, the middle of what. So what part of that question is like, you know, defining the thresholds of like, are you looking between an 80 and 120 of something, or a 60 and 100? But you know, as we know, and as we'll discuss a little more in the next few minutes, there's often large differences between what is the median income in a city or in a larger metropolitan region, or even looking at a national standard. The numbers can lead you in some pretty different places, and it's important to think about the ways that those factors influence what you see as middle neighborhoods when you apply one of these definitions. There are a number of other ways that one can define middle neighborhoods, and you know, at NCST we think these are perfectly valid approaches that we didn't take for our map, but Amber and Jason are going to talk a little bit about these and the work that they've done in their cities. You know, so one common method is to define middle neighborhoods based on home values. You know, where within a city or within a region does a neighborhood's home values fall on a scale. You know, another good indicator is where are neighborhood housing markets leading owners and landlords to invest in maintenance and to invest in exterior maintenance. And then, you know, a third effort is really looking at neighborhood housing markets within the regional context and perhaps making a typology. So I'll move next to, let's get the screen click. An example of the map. So rather than pulling up the map, I'm going to show you some screenshots today. But so this is what the map looks like. And here I've decided to focus on Philadelphia. So this is a map of the Philadelphia MSA. And what is highlighted here are census tracts with median household incomes between 80 and 120% of the regional median. So that is about $70,000 a year as a regional median. So these are census tracts with median incomes between 55 and 83. so this is what the map looks like when you get in there. It'll take you, I think it defaults to Cleveland, or if you've used the map before, the last location that you've that you worked in the map. And a couple features I wanted to point out. So in the top left is the area where you will choose among 7 different definitions of what a middle neighborhood is, all based on the income thresholds that I was discussing previously. And then you choose whether you want to be examining either the 2018 period or the 2010 period when you're looking at the map. We all know that a critical thing to think about when we think about middle neighborhoods is their trajectory towards either growth or towards decline. So we thought it was important to provide the ability to look at 2 different points in time. Looking towards the bottom left hand of your map, that's an ability to select a metropolitan statistical area, and the map will jump there and the census tract should reload, showing middle neighborhoods in that region. You can also navigate the map in the top right-hand corner by typing in any location, and I think at least in my experience, literally any property address works. And the last thing you can do is you can grab the map and scroll it much as you would in Google Maps, and it's based on the same core software as Google Maps, so the functionality should be quite intuitive to you. When you are grabbing and scrolling the map yourself, some of you who are on slower internet connections might see some delays in performance. And if that happens, we suggest that you click the refresh your map button located in the center of the bar right above the map. And that'll send a new query to the server, and your census tract should load pretty quickly. On the next slide is an example of a next bit of functionality in the map. So one thing to highlight here is I have switched the definition of middle neighborhoods we are applying. This is still a 2018 definition, but I am looking at lower income neighborhoods, both because I've selected a lower percentage threshold, 60 to 100%, but because I have shifted from looking at regional incomes to city incomes, which as in Philadelphia and many other regions across the country, city incomes are simply lower than regional or suburban incomes. So this is looking at much lower income census tracts than were displayed in the last map. These are census tracts with median household incomes between about $26,000 to $43,000 a year. The last bit of functionality I'll highlight is while you're in the map, you have the ability to click on a census tract, and the map displays in the right-hand bar a whole bunch of information about social, economic, housing indicators, all pulled from census data, as is the core income information we're using in the map. All of this information on this slide, this just shows you what the 7 different tests are that you can use in the map. This is all included on the Middle Neighborhoods website, and I'll put a link to the background page that has a bunch of this information in the chat as well, and sent the link directly to the map, but we have a background page as well. And so this just explains the 7 different tests that you can look at. So we built this tool because we wanted to provide a nationwide picture of middle neighborhoods, both so that practitioners in the field could understand the kind of the breadth and the extent of middle neighborhoods in regions across the country, but so that they could begin to use the tool to identify middle neighborhoods and to think about what those particular places are in their region. I think there are a couple caveats, and this is a good way to transfer into the presentations that Jason and Amber will be doing, where they talk about kind of the more detailed analysis and the more detailed work that was done in their cities. We think of this map as really a starting point for analysis by practitioners. There are a few limitations. One is that it's based on census tracts, which are a relatively large unit of analysis, especially when you're thinking literally about what are those block by block neighborhood strategies that are really gonna preserve or stabilize a middle neighborhood. The map's also based on 5-year ACS data. It's the best that's publicly available. We think it's great data, but you're not able to distinguish, for example, between 2014 and 2018 in this map. It's all collapsed into one into one layer. And the focus here is squarely on where middle income households live, and there are really good reasons to use that in part of your middle neighborhood analysis, but it's certainly not everything. So I will leave you here. As I do on these webinars, one of the reasons why I'm here is we're here to recruit you to the community of practice. So we hope that all of you will come to Middle Neighborhoods and sign up for our communications and everything like that. We've also posted the map on our website, so we hope that you'll go there and play around and look at middle neighborhoods in your region. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Jason Powers, who's the Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods leader, and he's going to talk about the work that he's done in his city. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get right into this. This is an hour-long presentation that'll be condensed to about 15 minutes. So if you have further questions and follow-ups, please, Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods is really excited to be helping sister cities all around the country with some of this stuff. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this moving. So when we talk about middle neighborhoods traditionally, at least initially, what we've often talked about is this place that's not quite strong, not quite weak, not fully distressed, not fully invested in. And what I've begun to use is this Venn diagram to really talk more accurately, I think, about the types of places we're describing. You can either describe them qualitatively, right? Like I just mentioned, you can walk down a street and have a sense of it. Quantitatively, you can use a map like the one was just described, where it's about middle incomes, 80 to 120. I've seen in Detroit, Future City, they did a Black middle class in which they used 80 to 200% AMI as a method of determining the middle class. So the qualitative stuff can be a little bit difficult. The quantitative stuff can be a little difficult. Something we really like to start with is the challenge question. So middle neighborhoods have similar challenges, and I think they're best described as a gap. And so the gap tends to be a gap in financing house renovations, a gap in marketing and perception challenges. And so because it's a gap, it means there are places that look strong and actually have these challenges. And then there are places that you might think are weaker, or their housing markets might be more on the edge. And those kinds of places actually have middle neighborhood qualities. And so from that, we broke up middle into these three categories: stable middle communities, which you think of as really those first suburbs, the stronger ones, places where buying a home, investing in it over time still makes sense, but by no means are these the McMansions, the cul-de-sacs, or the heavily invested areas. Stagnant middle markets, which we see a lot of in our cities, these are places that 20 years ago would have looked a lot like the stable middle communities, but they've seen decline. And then edge communities, which are prevalent in places like Cleveland and Buffalo and Detroit. These are the tipping point ones that a lot of the research is around, saying that if we don't invest now, they will move further to distress. So the first thing we did was we took a regional approach to this work. Most cities, and certainly our legacy Midwestern cities, are now places of choice where the average income can purchase a home almost in any neighborhood or community throughout the region. And so we need to think of this competitively. And so using a bandwidth of about $100 to $150 a square foot, which is that horizontal band, we find that range to be where homes present enough value that on the low end, you can invest in them, or on the high end, whether it's flipping or investing in a home and then selling it, you can expect to have developed equity. And when we did this kind of research, what we found using the regional market was that orange in this bar graph represents the suburbs of Cleveland. The neighborhoods of Cleveland basically did not exist in the middle. So you can see here, these are just Cleveland neighborhoods. And that really brought about a challenge for us. And I want to put that out for all of you to think critically about what it means to be in the middle. So in Cleveland, and I'm a city employee, it's my job to work on the city of Cleveland. The answer of where our middle neighborhood starts with the answer, we don't have one. Or rather, we have exactly one. What we have are these declining edge communities. And so that's where we're going to start, because your neighborhood, your toolkit, your implementations, what you can work on in these places can start anywhere as long as you're strategic about your approach. And so we needed to go a little further. I like to use the metaphor of a patient showing up at a doctor's office and saying, this is what I'm feeling. That qualitative information can help with the diagnosis, but at the end of the day, an MRI, a CAT scan, that's the kind of tool that really shows exactly what's going on and isn't affected by the stories we hear. And so we needed something like that for our neighborhoods. So what we wanted to do was develop an index, because if you take one variable, let's say incomes, like on the other map, that'll show you a certain type of description of your communities, right? The lower income, the moderate income, et cetera. Now, if you were to take a different variable, like the owner occupancy percent, which is very important when it comes to community stabilization, the challenge is, what if those two maps don't look the same? What if they're divergent? Maybe 80% of the areas are similar, strong home ownership, strong home values, strong incomes. But what about the places that don't quite read the same way? So an index tool allows us to do that. And in Cleveland, we've partnered with Case Western Reserve University to develop an index tool that creates a neighborhood typology of the entire county. We're currently at 174 variables, which is probably too many. But the computer is able to spit out what it does is it takes all of those variables. It's everything from home values to where SNAP benefits are used the most, to housing choice vouchers, to proximity to commercial corridors, to proximity to highways. It can take all of these different data tools that we just are fortunate to have collected in Cleveland, and it looks for correlations. And so what it's telling you is, yes, these 14 different block groups are all over the place. And yet the qualities of living here, the qualities of this area are similar to those others. That's really important, especially in a region with so many municipalities like Cleveland and like many others, because it's hard sometimes to get past the brand of a place and just see what these places really look like underneath. So this is not a tool that's public yet, like the NCST tool, but getting there. This is the current typology map of Cuyahoga County. For those of you that are familiar, which I assume is the minimum of people in our audience today, this map shows what a lot of Clevelanders would say they already would have expected. Areas of distress on the east side of Cleveland, areas of transition between the east side and the outer ring suburbs, and then areas of wealth and affluence as you move out. But what's important to recognize is that these different places, again, are not necessarily marked in a barometer of income or housing value or square footage or number of bungalows. It's an index that's showing all of these things are similar. And it's up to us, the practitioners, to put labels on them, which is honestly the most challenging part of our work. We have to be able to say that the yellow areas and the light green areas have some quality that we're going to say at some point describes them, because if we keep labeling them 1, 2, 3 or A, B, C, it won't tell us enough. And so as we go through these different areas, and I'll do this quickly, it begins to tell the story of these places. So everything you see here, the dark purple and then that lighter shade of purple, represent the different typology of these neighborhoods. And practitioners can use this tool to distinguish what is traditionally hard to. On the east side of Cleveland, that whole area traditionally is considered a homogeneous, lower income distressed area, which we know is completely not true. And the history of redlining has really brought those kinds of communities to be marked as one type of community, disinvested. But the truth is that not only do some of these have commercial corridors that are either vibrant or could be invested in very easily, some are closer to major employers like hospitals. And so being able to take what is normally one color and put it into 2 colors immediately makes a bit of a difference. But then going to these next 2, these areas are also challenging. So edge markets in Cleveland really are lower income. Our area median income is $56,000 and the city median income is $24,000. So not even at the 80 percentile for AMI. But if you look at these edge places, what you start to see is sort of the outline of our city. And on the east side, you notice that it kind of bleeds out into the first ring suburbs. The important thing about this tool is by getting rid of the traditional boundaries of our municipalities, it forces you to think about these places as their economies, as the types of housing that they have in these places, and shows you a very different way of looking at it. Stable middle markets, as mentioned earlier, they're your traditional, first ring suburb where there's still value in homes. If you look on the west side of Cleveland here, what you'll see is it goes way out into almost the exurbs. And you might think, well, Strongsville and Cleveland Heights, 2 different suburbs of Cleveland, most people would never put them in the same bucket for a lot of reasons. But if you, again, remove that brand, those perceptions, and some of those valid qualitative reasons, quantitatively, there are many blocks throughout Strongsville that have 1950s colonials and bungalows with 1 bathroom, 3 bedrooms, and look exactly like University Heights on the east side of Cleveland. So we needed this X-ray, as I called it, to look at these places differently. This is your traditional suburb map. And this is one that's interesting because the thing that marks these areas is that they have extreme investment. So this is your downtown Cleveland. This is your near west side. They might have the same density, the same incomes as other parts of the suburbs. But what's different about them is that velocity of investment. So we use this tool to start, and it starts to give us a different way of looking at things. And as a practitioner, my job is to be able to sell that we need this work to be supported. We need new loan tools. We need new financing tools. We need new support from foundations and new toolkit ideas. And part of these maps allows me to make the case that Cleveland isn't necessarily how you think it is. So here's a perfect example, downtown Cleveland, and on the west side, it's Lakewood. Very similar markets, very similar typologies. And the area in between, which is along Lake Erie shore, is where we see the weakness. And so if we're working with the Metro Park system, we want to talk about how we can use green connectors in these two areas to really incentivize growth and investment in these places. Similarly, when talking to developers, single family home building is almost non-existent on the city's east side, southeast side. This yellow line is the border of Cleveland. You can notice that on that southeast border, it's identical, according to our index, between Cleveland and Warrensville Heights and Shaker Heights. And yet, if you think of Cleveland, you typically start to immediately think something is different about Cleveland. It's the schools, it's the perception of safety, it's a lot of things. So this is a way of writing that question. Another one is that within these communities we have, they're not homogenous. So Cleveland has 39 neighborhoods and 400,000 people. So some of our neighborhoods are bigger than any of our suburbs, 35,000 person neighborhoods. This is Old Brooklyn here. And as you can see, there's 4 different typology neighborhoods within it. So very quickly, you can use this tool to then get what I call sort of the baseball card statistics. So here's the top few statistics that describe all of those places. Again, disparate geographies, sometimes clustered, sometimes not. Very different school districts, trash pickup, services, right? Very significant differences on the top layer. But when you look at these qualities, you'll start to notice why they cluster. And so we use these two in particular, the edge and stable markets, to come up with a map like this, which shows us where in the city of Cleveland we want to start the work. And so I'll push through to get us to why we need to go further and then hand it off. These are the 4 neighborhoods that those circles coordinate with. And as you can see, they are massive. So we need to get closer. So here's Old Brooklyn. And what we want to do is find a way to get more into the street by street level. So you'll notice here the transition occurring about central to the community. We can use GIS and basic MLS data to look at the transactions of sales. And by using this, green here is the stable community level. Blue is where you start to see that really edge middle class. In this one, we'll see those white and yellow are really where you start to see that these are homes that are not keeping the value yet and don't see a lot of investment. And then non-zero transfers are where we start to see distressed sales. And so when you zoom in on the block level, and now you can start to see the bakeries and the schools and really see street by street level, you get the opportunity to really see that transition in a very small area. You can throw a baseball from the first picture to the final picture, and with a strong enough arm, that is. And that's how close this transition takes place. It's really critical that we see these places, because when we get there and we find out where these transitions are, we get to our last area of the slide deck, which is strategic focus areas. There's 800 homes here and about 44 commercial properties. That is bite-sized. That is something that the city of Cleveland can say, we've got citywide tools, and then we have one little earmark that we're going to use in these strategic areas. How do we help the small businesses here? How do we allocate more trees to plant in these particular areas where the canopy is limited? Cleveland needs 1 million more trees for its climate compact. And yet, when we get the trees, we end up placing them in parks, because it's hard to do the outreach to find out where you place them in municipal areas and homes. And so if we're going to have to use a little bit of community engagement work, well, then we should use our CDCs in these areas. So this is where we get into the more strategic area. Lee Harvard, Bel Air Puritas, 2 other middle neighborhoods where we have the ability to use this tool. Now you can see we've gotten much smaller, 5,400 person, smaller areas. Our demographics match the city of Cleveland, so we're able to make these sustainable places for home ownership for our communities of color and moderate income families. And that leads to Amber.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to have both David and Jason here to kind of tee up what I have to talk about. So we've done very similar work with data in Des Moines, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also how we've then used that data and information to start reorienting our approach to neighborhood revitalization work and developing a strategy for specific places. So I just want to preface this by saying that in our beginning stages, we were not aiming to find our middle neighborhoods. We went into this data work actually as an evaluation of the City of Des Moines Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which has been around since the late 80s. And it was due for a holistic evaluation. From a staff level, we felt like we were kind of spinning our wheels and not seeing the results in terms of neighborhood change that we wanted to see. And so we really went into this asking the question, have our efforts been working? And then more broadly, what's been going on in the region, the city, and at the neighborhood level that might inform our approach going forward. Just a few quick notes about the region where Des Moines is located. So we are central Iowa. We have been one of the fastest growing metros in the Midwest over the last couple of years. And so our metro population as a whole is somewhere between 650 and 700,000 at this point, with Des Moines making up about a third of that population. When we did our data analysis, we looked at multiple geographies. So we looked at everything from what was going on in the region, down to the city, down to the neighborhood, down to the parcel level. And I'll talk briefly about some of those things. One thing that I want to mention about Des Moines proper is that we are, I guess, defined as a soft market city. So our population has been growing slowly over the last decade in the city of Des Moines proper. Most of that population growth has been occurring in downtown as we've had thousands of new housing units coming online, converting old office space and other warehouse buildings. But what that soft market means for us is we don't have widespread vacancy like you might see in other communities, but we also don't have strong demand for our older homes. Our suburbs are growing like crazy. You can get very affordable new construction outside of the city. And so that has left us with a lot of disinvestment in our city neighborhoods. And just to illustrate that, this slide shows property value appreciation from 2000 to 2016, and you can see that Des Moines is lagging behind our suburban communities pretty substantially when it comes to value appreciation. So when we look at that at a neighborhood level for Des Moines and compare that to how inflation performed over that same time period, we've got about 2/3 of the city's neighborhoods where values have not been appreciating at a rate that keeps pace with inflation. And so that becomes a huge problem for our property owners who are then not building equity in their homes, as well as for our city that is trying to continue to provide quality services when we have been experiencing a structural deficit in our budget over the last 20 years. So this was really the crux of the problem that our city leadership wanted to solve. And was kind of became the critical question of, okay, where can we intervene and have the most impact with limited resources? So like I said, we looked at a variety of data, but I'm only going to focus on a piece of it today. One of the major indicators for us became property conditions. And part of the reason for that was because as we looked at property conditions, there was such a strong correlation between what was true on the ground at a parcel level and then property values and demographics. So poor conditions really correlated by location with low values and low incomes, which shouldn't be a terrible surprise, but it was definitely something that we wanted to corroborate. One of the things that we did, and this was a suggestion of the consultant that we worked with at CZB, we ended up doing a field survey of every residential parcel in the city. So that's about 89,000 parcels where we sent our staff and a team of interns out to walk or drive every single block and give a quick windshield first impression score of 1 to 5 based on the overall condition and care of that house. So we really started with that question of, is someone taking care of this home and property? And if the answer was yes, okay, well, are they doing really well? Are they, is this a magazine worthy photo here from the exterior? Then it's a 1. If it's just kind of so-so, that's an average condition, it's a 3, and so on. Our 5s were the ones that are boarded up and experiencing lots of red flags of disinvestment. And then we use that information in a variety of ways. So one of the things that we looked at is, okay, by neighborhood, where do we fall in terms of the percentage of properties that are in good or excellent condition versus the ones that are kind of in really poor condition. So these charts started to compare those two ends of the spectrum, leaving out the middle. And one of the things our working group did is sat around with this for an hour and said, okay, if we had to divide the city into categories of strong, middle, and weak, where would we draw those lines? Another thing that we did with that was then create a typology. So while this was very much based on our field survey scoring and property conditions, it did also consider things like values and sale prices and some of the other information that we looked at. And like I said before, those things really strongly correlated across the board. So in this typology, we ended up only breaking the city into 6 different categories or types of neighborhoods, 1 and 2 being the strongest or the healthiest markets, 3 and 4 being our middle markets, and then 5 and 6 being our weakest, most distressed neighborhoods. And as you can see, we've got about 27 of our 50 some neighborhoods that fall into those middle 2 categories. So the vast majority of Des Moines is actually what we might consider to be a middle neighborhood. That's how that looks on the map. I think one note that I wanted to make for the practitioners out there that are looking to do this in their own city, we learned that we needed to be really careful about how we labeled neighborhoods and how we labeled this map and how we talked about markets. Neighborhoods are very personal geographies to people. And so even coloring something red on a map was offensive to some in our community. So I just wanted to share that note and lesson learned from our end. The other thing we did then with those property scores is we started looking at, okay, what is it actually going to cost to move the needle in a given geography? And so we did some polling of our rehabbers, whether they were private investors or nonprofits, and we figured out, okay, what's the average cost to do kind of a moderate rehab, modest rehab, something that would take something we scored a 3 that's in average condition to a 2 being in really good condition. And then what would it cost to take a 4 and do a more substantial rehab to get it to excellent condition, and so on. We built out a giant spreadsheet with that and said, okay, what if, for the sake of the thought exercise, what if we did 3 rounds of interventions where in a given neighborhood, we came through and did an initial sweep and touched about 15% of each of the types that we wanted to move. So our 3s, our 4s, our 5s. And that ended up giving us a rough cost per block group to get to what we felt was an appropriate tipping point where the private market then might have the confidence to invest on its own and carry that momentum forward over time. So I realize this map is very small and you probably can't see the numbers, but what it allowed us to do was, as Jason mentioned, kind of take a step back from how people identified with neighborhoods as a place or as a brand or as something that was personal to them, and just look at pure numbers. Okay, well, if we were in this census block group, it would cost us about 1.5 million to move the needle. But if we're over here, then it's 9 million. And that's just based on the number of properties that are in poor condition. So we were really trying to figure out where we could have the most impact given our limited resources. The other question we were answering, and I see there's a bunch of questions popping up, so we'll come back to those when we're done. We quantified this as about an $800 million problem citywide. We don't have nearly the resources to put to that. So the question was, where do we start and where do we have the best opportunity for success with the resources we have? So we started looking at where are the assets in our community, where are the major institutions like hospitals or higher education, colleges and universities. But we also looked at things like, where is there development occurring? Is there a big development project that might be spurring some momentum in an area that we could tag onto? Where do we have a particularly strong group of neighbors that would want to get involved in this? And then we had some politics at play, so we ended up with one in each of our city council wards. And with all of that, we ended up with 4 different pilot areas. So the intention is that we're not done with these 4, but we are going to spend about 10 years in each one of these areas. We did a neighborhood plan for each of those areas that dug into the specifics of each area a lot more. Each of our 4 areas falls on a very different point in the spectrum from unhealthy or healthy to unhealthy. We are still very much learning. InvestESM is only about a year old, so we are still very much learning what is going to work and not work and how we're building out our toolkit. But I think I'm going to talk just very briefly about 2 of our areas. And one of the things we've discovered is that we need kind of a responsive strategy to the energy that's already there in the neighborhood, and then a more proactive strategy to approach some of the problems that we're trying to solve. So Franklin area is our healthiest. It's a 3 in our typology. Property values here are outperforming the average in the city, but they're still lagging behind inflation. And it's one of these places that we really want to prevent from going downhill. You know, we're starting to see a lot of deferred maintenance. There's at least 1 property, if not more, on every single block in this area that's starting to show that sign of disinvestment. And so we want to prevent it from going downhill. But this area has a very high capacity group of residents who are very excited about getting involved. And so our early programs, they've really jumped on and been easy to convince to participate. I think from a proactive standpoint, we're really looking at more, how do we erase some of the poor property conditions? How do we build in more affordable housing units into this area? Because currently it's not the most affordable area in the city. And so it's been really important to us and to this neighborhood to start and build out some of that income diversity. And then being very intentional about the types of improvements that we're making to add value to the properties. Columbus Park sits at the other end of the spectrum of our 4 pilot areas. So this is the one, it's a type 4 verging on type 5. We have a lot more vacancy in this neighborhood, a lot more houses that have just declined to the point where they really need to be demolished. We also have a high immigrant population in this neighborhood. And so we're still in the phase very much of building trust and trying to get to know what those residents need from us in order to be successful. So from a proactive standpoint, we do have more planned in terms of redevelopment, again, trying to address some of that vacancy and poor conditions in properties with replacing some of those units with something new. This neighborhood sits just directly south of downtown and has the great opportunity to be sort of a downtown adjacent and yet kind of affordable family neighborhood. So that's a little bit of a difference. One quick note about our organization. So we were created just a little bit over a year ago. It really grew out of this whole effort of evaluating Des Moines' program. The city and the county partnered together, and they are our 2 funders at the moment. I think the landscape in Des Moines in terms of community development is maybe a little bit different from some other places, bigger places. We don't have any CDCs here, and our neighborhood associations are all volunteer. So while we do have quite a network of neighborhood associations, the capacity really varies widely. So InvestESM was put into place to be kind of a broad umbrella for neighborhood revitalization work. We have these 4 areas that we're focusing on right now with the intent to expand. And it was really important to our council that this was an additive strategy so that we weren't taking resources away from our other neighborhoods, our more distressed neighborhoods. So this was not a situation where we said, okay, we're going to shift all the money that we normally put into neighborhoods and we're going to ignore our most distressed parts and focus on these middle places. This was, okay, we're going to continue doing what we're doing and we're going to add a new layer of resources to try and prevent middle neighborhoods from becoming the next set of distressed neighborhoods. So InvestESM has a commitment for a $50 million program budget over the next 10 years. And we are really excited to report back in a few years and let you know how that's going. So I will end there. Here's my contact information if you need it as a follow-up after the session, and I think we'll turn it over to questions.
Okay, hi everyone, it's Marcia Nedland. I'm one of the organizers of the Community of Practice. And for a variety of technical reasons about Zoom, I'm the one who's gonna manage the Q&A today. So Amber, since you got really close to this one question already, I'll just have you finish that out. You spoke to the issue of, the original question I should say was, did equity and addressing systematic inequity due to the consequences of redlining get looked at in Des Moines and Cleveland? And I interpret that question as, as what you kind of answered by saying, we didn't take anything away from our more distressed neighborhoods where, they're in, I assume in many cases, those neighborhoods might have been middle neighborhoods too, had they not suffered the consequences of systemic racism for all of these decades. So the strategy, I guess, is probably just a different kind of strategy, right?
Well, I think I would say yes and no in answer to that question. We certainly talked about, equity and all of that, and that was very much a consideration with the choice to layer on these resources as opposed to shifting resources. And I should also say that the city has stepped up a lot of the resources that they are putting towards other neighborhoods in Des Moines as well. We were fortunate to pass a local option sales tax in the midst of doing this. And so that provided resources not only to us at InvestCSM, but also to neighborhoods citywide in terms of infrastructure and public safety improvements. That said, our council did make a choice that the real North Star we were aiming for with this particular intervention was more about how do we stabilize the tax base for our entire community so that we can continue to provide the services that we need to for everybody. So really the crux of the problem that we were trying to solve was not as much about equity as it was about correcting the lack of equity that owners were building in their homes, and also the budget deficit that the city had been experiencing. And that's been controversial in our community too. Not everybody's a fan of that approach, but that was the choice that was made at the time.
Yeah. And Jason, do you have anything any comments to make about that topic from the perspective of Cleveland?
Yeah,
Cleveland is more distressed than Des Moines.
Yeah, so this is something that comes up in almost every conversation, one-on-ones and these larger ones. The areas that we've identified as strategic middle neighborhood places, 40% of them received D grades back and were redlined. About 50% of them were C grade and about 10% were B grade. So these are actually the areas that have suffered for 60 years with the consequences of that racist policy. And as you noticed in my demographics, 43% are African-American and 16% Hispanic. These are representative places of both the type of people that live in Cleveland that are part of our communities, as well as representative of places that are actually in distress. The only major difference about these places and others that might have more concentrated distress is that for one reason or another, the housing stock, the incomes, different things have allowed them to hold on a little longer, but by no means are these places really even modest income by county levels. They're places that need this attention. And so just like what Amber said, and I really appreciate that she added this, Cleveland is dedicated to not changing any of reallocating any resources from distress to middle, but thinking of middle as though it's separate from distress and separate from the redlining history is to misunderstand that these are actually very challenged communities that just need this kind of help.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. I think Susan Evans asked the question about what resources were being tapped. And so I think Amber answered that. Most, if not all of her budget is coming from revenue from a sales tax increase that was happening while they were developing all this. What about you, Jason? I think you're tapping some existing programs that your neighborhoods are eligible for anyway.
We're doing it. Yeah, exactly. So we're doing a few things. We're looking at tools we already have. So the city of Cleveland in March inaugurated a construction gap subsidy program, and it's a citywide program. Whereas I simply am working very closely with CDCs that are in our middle neighborhoods to try to get them through the pipeline. Because the construction gap, that $20,000, $30,000 gap, is really everything in stalling our markets. When it comes to, I mentioned tree plantings, we already have the budget for annual tree plantings, and we want to get them into people's front yards instead of only into parks. So it sometimes is about trying to find our best way to get them out there. Additionally, we're really going to be leveraging the private sector. So something that these middle markets can do is that in the stronger parts of them, they have a product that can be invested in, that the lack of information by our banking community, by our real estate community, is why they're not. And so again, these are areas that in some cases were redlined and today still suffer that same challenge. We're selling with our real estate tools the story that these are places to invest in. So we're working with local and regional banks to develop a potential lending product. And finally, we are going to the foundations locally for next steps over the next couple of years, so we can report back on new things that we're trying to get in and pilots.
Yeah. Nationally, I would say, generally speaking, middle neighborhood strategies tend to get more of their funding from, like their lending capital comes from their CDFI. If there is a CDFI in the community, attracts those kind of resources, or the markets are still healthy enough to attract, if not conventional loan products, sometimes even we see a lot of community bank portfolio products that are put out in those communities, and a lot of foundation money too. It tends, not, some of the neighborhoods are eligible for CDBG and home, but as our two panelists have said, first of all, they try and avoid removing any of that funding from more distressed neighborhoods, and often middle neighborhoods aren't eligible for it in the first place. Let's see. Andy asks if you guys can speak to community resident engagement throughout the identification process and developing plans for moving forward. Amber, you want to start? If you're talking, Amber, we can't hear you. And let's see.
You want me to jump in there first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, community engagement is really important. In Cleveland, we're really fortunate to have a very strong CDC network that has, they're all over the place when it comes to what their engagement strategies and histories have been, but many have really strong, robust block club connections, community meetings and committees. And so we started with a lot of outreach to the CDCs that held meetings or actual conversations with residents. But what I wanted to add was, while the mapping tool and those things can benefit from those conversations, really what I've learned over the last year and a half is how important those conversations are to the work, to getting it out. So for example, if you have a really wonderful and innovative lending tool that can make a huge difference in the way that our homes are purchased and rehabbed in these areas, but if it's just a brochure sitting in Bank of America's lobby at the retail branch, then it's never going to go anywhere. Or if the communities don't trust the banks, which a lot of our communities have right reasons not to, then they're not going to see that as a tool for them or understand it. So if we get our communities to tell us what their challenges are, for example, my neighbor wanted to buy this home and was unable to get an appraisal value. Well, then we learn from them and we talk about these tools that we have that might be helpful. That's really how you roll out programs. So the mapping tool, yes, but I'd say even more so practice.
Mm-hmm. I see Amber's definitely here now. You want to speak to that, Amber?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what I hit, but I'm back now. Yeah, I would agree with Jason. I would say with our mapping work, we had some involvement from residents at a high level. That was more of a staff elected official partner exercise. Where we've really had our as resident involvement is as we have focused on a specific place. And so, that's when we really pull together residents to try and learn more from them about that specific area. So we didn't do it quite as much on the citywide level. We got into it a lot more as we focused on our individual neighborhoods.
Well, Amber, were you one of the places where you invited regular citizens to do any of the scoring? I know sometimes in other projects that CCB has done, that has been the case.
We didn't this time, although I think when we redo it, we probably will.
Mm-hmm. So I know that they've done that in other places where residents, usually not their own neighborhood, but they're really encouraged along the way to be involved in doing some of the scoring if they're interested, because then they have a deeper understanding of where it comes from and what it's all about. Let's see. Winnie Branton poses a question that I'm going to add to. She says, what was the cost of putting together, I think she's referring to Amber's plan, for the 4 neighborhoods, gathering the data, mapping, and the written report and everything that went into it? I also think something that's implied in that question is that we've shown 2 practitioners here who have pretty sophisticated, probably resource intensive systems they've put together. And we definitely, that is not the only way to do it. So I know that Jason does a good job of describing how you can arrive at some of the same conclusions he did in slightly less complicated ways. And one of the reasons he chose to develop this mapping system was not just for the middle neighborhoods, but was for the whole city's work and neighborhoods in general. But I don't know, Amber, are you prepared to say how much you invested in your strategy? It was over a couple of 2 or 3 years too, right?
It was. We had 2 phases of that. So we had the initial program evaluation phase, which included all of the citywide data analysis. And then we had a second contract where we did the 4 neighborhood plans.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been long enough now that I don't remember the dollar amount on the first phase. I know for the 4 plans, it was about $75,000 per plan, maybe a little bit less actually. But that was also rolled in with, we were concurrently looking at our entire implementation system and how we needed to reorient that. Normally, City of Des Moines staff would have done those neighborhood plans in-house. It's just because we were taking a more market-based approach this time, we kept that same consulting team with us. So. Yeah,
and I was part of, although a very, very small part of that consulting team. So I didn't even know what the total costs were, but I know how long it took. So I know there were a team of 4 or 5, sometimes 6 people in and out of there over the course of, I don't know, 9 months, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we did 4 neighborhood plans in 9 months, which is also a lot faster than we would typically do that.
But as you mentioned, at least half of that team of people was all the time. Some of us were in the neighborhoods, but everybody else was at the city working with you and with code enforcement and with Parks and Rec and with economic development to think about what they could do differently with their policies and programs to make this work more efficiently.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, Jason, how can somebody go from the big mapping tool that David's given us to getting more specific about where the first places they might want to take on to intervene without developing a big mapping system like you did?
You all want to know how to do it on a shoestring budget.
Yes, on a shoestring.
Yeah, so first off, I'll happily give the range. We had 3 bids between $60,000 and $140,000 for the indexing typology tool.
Okay.
And I'll say this without giving away who we went with, but I won't give away how much. But look at the tools in your backyard. So in the city of Cleveland and in our region, we are very lucky to have some very strong data collection that is done, and it's all centrally aggregated and held. at something called Neo Can Do, and Case Western Reserve University has endless reports and studies that they do in this work. And so by partnering with them, immediately we're going to get more bang for our buck. And then beyond that, and I said this earlier today in another presentation, GIS is something that a lot of people learn, even people that don't have degrees in planning. It's almost like learning video editing tools or something for a lot of people. It's fun, I suppose. And so if you can access the data, which is the whole important part, you can get a couple of undergrads who have just taken a GIS mapping class, and they can map the real estate data. They can probably aggregate and find trends in it. It's really not that difficult to make it a capstone project, maybe for a graduate student, and have some of this work started that way, developing the maps and building it. The hard part is the practitioners analyzing what the map means and then talking to the neighborhoods and connecting those dots. So it really can be done pretty easily. And the NLS data, the transaction data for real estate, everyone's county or area should be recording that. So yeah, it's very doable, I think.
Yeah, you'd be surprised if you really sat down and thought, it's very hard these days, I guess I would say, as being a person who's really into neighborhood planning. A lot of the funding that we get is like from HUD. They want us to use it for a specific tool. It sort of precludes planning, but get in a room together some smart people with some residents, and you can logically get to a much, I think, more intentional and thoughtful and effective strategy than just announcing program availability across the city. One more question we have here from Alex Simmons was for Amber about when you identified the specific dollar amounts for different block groups, were the prescribed solutions / recommendations different based on neighborhood condition, or were they across the board recommendations? And I think those dollar amounts were about property conditions specifically, right? Moving from
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
if a property is a 5, how many of those 5s are there in that community? And if you did 15% of them, how much would it cost to get them up to a 2?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good description of what we did. And it was never intended to be a perfect or a completely accurate. We were really looking for a ballpark.
Mhm.
And also trying to make the point that when you have a high prevalence of poor property conditions, it's a much more expensive and longer term proposition to fix. And so because our question was, where can we get the best impact with limited resources in a shorter time frame, it just helped us to answer some of those questions. So as far as how we developed the costs, we pulled a dozen rehabbers in the community. So that could be a private investor that's flipping homes to a developer or a contractor that does rehabs for a living, to nonprofits that were doing rehabs. And then we just kind of averaged that out. So it was more for the thought exercise of trying to understand how costs varied based on property conditions. And then, yes, when it came to strategies, there are different approaches in different places. So for our areas, the blocks that have high concentrations of properties in really poor conditions, there's probably more of a demolition strategy there potentially, or taking things off of tax sale and trying to gain ownership, maybe some land banking, than there would be where you only have one property in poor condition on a block. So there were definitely some ways that we broke out strategy with that as well.
Yeah, and I do think, one of the things that's really unusual in this approach, which I really like and I wish we did more of, is that it did force, I think, the participants at the city to have some grip on really what the costs are that we're talking about here. And as Amber, most of us, we don't do that. We pick an area that needs work and you just work on it with whatever resources you have available, right? You don't really define an end goal and actually think about how much it's going to cost. And anyway, I think that there are, if the goal is meeting basic housing needs, in a more distressed neighborhood, you know, that's absolutely valuable, absolutely required. It's the right thing to do. It's necessary, and it's still funded there. In these middle neighborhoods, I think my interpretation is that the city was saying, okay, in these neighborhoods, we don't really need to meet people's basic housing needs. You know, that's not the biggest problem that's going on. But if we don't attend to the loss of value, in 20 years, the city isn't going to have any tax revenue to deliver services to anybody at all. And
Yes.
so it's just solving a different problem. Both problems are really important. And there in no way is it meant to take away from basic housing needs and safety and all the other things, opportunity in more distressed neighborhoods. So David, I want to hand it back to you to just finish us off.
Absolutely. Well, so thank you everyone who for staying on. And I know we've gone a couple minutes over our allotted time. It's just because there's so much to talk about. And I know there were a couple other great questions that we'll try to get back to you guys outside the webinar, because we unfortunately didn't have time to get through to them all today. But I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank you for caring about middle neighborhoods and you know, their fate in communities across the country. And I want to thank Marsha and her team, and Amber and Jason for joining us and for making today's session such a success. So you know, I hope to hear from you. I hope you use the tool. We're going to record the session and distribute it to all of you, so don't need to worry about that. And well, we hope this is the start of a conversation rather than the end. So thank you very much, everyone.